Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today, we will discuss a module on Pakeha identity of the South Pacific and the literatures. This module is written by Shashwati Saha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sikkim University. In this module, we will talk about what is South Pacific, where is South Pacific, what is Pakeha, and what is Pakeha identity, whether it is fixed or fluid, and Pakeha literature and the literary culture, and then we will summarize our discussion. In this module, we will identify the region called South Pacific and try to understand the literary culture of the region on the basis of the history which generates two very distinct groups of people, the Maori and the Pakeha. The module gives a brief understanding of the term Pakeha and shows how the identity of the Pakeha is not determined by one racial or ethnic similarity, but by the lived experience of being in Aotearoa. The next section talks about the identity of the Pakeha, how they assimilated with the land and made it their own. We will try to understand whether the identity of the Pakeha can be fixed or is it still fluid given its heterogeneity, biculturalism and flexibility. The next section is a major discussion on the literary culture of the Pakeha, which has evolved and changed according to the settlers' attitude towards the native indigenous people. Introduction. Where is the South Pacific? The region of the South Pacific gets its name from the numerous European mapping that has happened post-contact history. The region has its own indigenous name. In the Maori language, it is called Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, or the Great Ocean of Kiwa. The legendary Polynesia explorer and guardian of the sea. Earliest known European labels of this region, coined mainly by the late 18th century explorers, include South Seas or the South Sea Islands. It is only after the Second World War that the term South Pacific came into use. First used by the Western Alliance military forces during the war in the Pacific. However, the term South Pacific is quite misleading, as Epili Hawaofa points out, not just those islands that lie south of the equator. It covers the whole region from the Marianas, deep in the North Pacific, to New Zealand in the south. But the label South Pacific is widely used. Of late, the term Pacific Island region has also come into use and has served to differentiate the smaller island of the Pacific from their larger neighbors like New Zealand and Australia. This can be positively viewed as the sign of the socio-political independence of these small islands. While all these European labels refer to the Pacific region as a whole, the indigenous Pacific, as Michael Keown points out, has also been divided into three geocultural subcategories known as Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. These labels were coined to impose imperialist geographical and racial framework on the various people of the Pacific. The grouping together of the island of the Pacific has always been a result of the profit motive of international agencies and multinational business corporations, as a result of which these small islands have become the sites of major experimentation, including testing grounds of nuclear weapons of the economic and political powers of the world. This has given rise to a corpus of protest literature in this region. So, we have talked about what is the South Pacific and how South Pacific has been built through the invasion of European and the traveling of the European on the sea and the ocean, and how cartography constructed this region as South Pacific. Now let us talk about the Pakeha identity. Any discussion on Pakeha literary genre is impossible without knowing what Pakeha means. A rough sketch of the Pakeha cultural history, cultural identity is inevitable before beginning any discussion on Pakeha literature. Therefore, this section will try to understand the term Pakeha. Pakeha is a term used to denote the white New Zealanders, mainly comprising of the settlers from Europe. The first recorded use of the word Pakeha is in the Treaty of Waitangi. A Pakeha initially was a white man who came from England and settled and worked in New Zealand. Later the term came to be used more generally to denote any fair-skinned person who was born in New Zealand. Mary Ellen O'Connor, 1990, defines Pakeha as the dominant white race in New Zealand. This would cover anybody of Anglo-Celtic origin like England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and as the integrated northern Europeans like Scandinavians, Germans and Dutch, white Americans, Canadians and South Africans. But in order to understand a Pakeha, one must also understand the term Maori, because a white New Zealander is a Pakeha only in relation to a Maori or an indigenous Polynesian inhabitant of New Zealand. The term Maori was used by the indigenous population to describe them as different from the European settlers. But with time, the term got adopted by the Europeans to describe the indigenous people. But according to living Maoris of New Zealand, a Maori do not primarily use the term to describe themselves, but only use the tribe name, as they are essentially tribal people. A Maori is a Maori only in relation to Pakeha, thus denoting the linguistic, racial, ethnic and cultural difference between the indigenous people of Aotearoa and the European settlers. Michael King, in his books Being Pakeha, 1985, defines Pakeha as denoting non-Maori New Zealanders. Some people consider Pakeha to be a derogatory term or an insult hurled at the fair-skinned people of non-Polynesian descent in New Zealand. According to them, the term Pakeha means long pig or white pig. Some New Zealanders of white descent are reluctant to call themselves as Pakeha, also because the term originated in a language that is not their own. Such people prefers words like Caucasians or New Zealand European. But both these terms are problematic since it covers wide range of people, and second or third generation of settlers cannot be called Europeans anymore. However, considerably early records dating back to the mid-19th century show the European missionaries and government officials also referred to themselves as Pakeha. The changing usage of the term Pakeha complicates the notion of ethnicity. If an ethnic group comprised of people who share common ancestry, culture and history, then Pakeha can never refer to an ethnic group, as it comprises a mixed bag of fair-skinned people of different ethnic or racial origin. Therefore, the term Pakeha or Maori offer us a way to differentiate between the historical origins of settlers, the Polynesian and European. Pakeha, its origin at meaning by Jody Ranford. The issue of Pakeha identity, fixed or fluid. So now, as we have already talked about the Pakeha people and the relative identity between Pakeha and Maori, their relative identity we have talked about. And now let us talk about the Pakeha identity, whether this Pakeha identity is fluid or fixed. Stuart Hall, writing about modern cultural identities, remarked that it is a rather fluid, which develop in the border zone between older identities, labels their construction a self-reflective process which takes place only in the context of difference. It is a process never completed, always in process. It is not determined in the sense that it can always be won or lost, sustained or abandoned. Identity can therefore be described as arising not only from where and who one is at any given moment, but also from the place one has come from and from influences that stream back towards it, as well as from the destination towards which one is traveling. Hall states that modern cultural identities are transitory and are increasingly fragmented and fractured, never singular but multiply constructed across different, often intersecting and antagonistic discourses, practices, and positions. Identity, therefore, is how one behaves at any stopping point along one's journey in interaction with all the other behaviors that one finds in this location. Pakeha identity, therefore, is neither that of the colonizer nor of the pre-colonial, but a predominantly unique and hybrid post-colonial subjectivity, which might be constitutive of the two as well. Since the Pakehas constitute of the fair-skinned population, therefore, they come to be regarded as essentially bad oppressor who is responsible for exclusionary racism. But as Paul Spoonley points out, the question, both theoretically and politically, is whether there is room for alternative conceptualization of dominant identity. It is this image of being the bad oppressor that deters the study of the white men's relationship and their interdependence with the subdominant identities. According to Maori cultural advisor and actor Rangi Moano Taylor, the word Pakeha can be applied to people who are willing to make a commitment to live here. The idea of bones of the ancestors does come into it. There must be no other place that they call home. John Black points out that there is an obligation inherent in the word Pakeha, which is a gift given by Maori born out of a relationship with them bound by some promises of partnership, as well as a word for describing a people unlike any other who exist nowhere else. Therefore, being a Pakeha cannot be politically neutral. Being a Pakeha would mean, by definition, a New Zealander who has agreed to be a treaty partner of the Maoris and take their responsibility and perform their duties of the post-colonial people towards the Maoris. It simply does not mean wiping out the memory of being a colonist and therefore not taking responsibility of the actions ensuing from the process. It means that they now belong to New Zealand as much as the Maoris and have a culture that had developed from their experiences of being in Aotearoa. This will also mean that no other name describes their cultural identity and they now belong to no other place or space. The boundaries around the Pakeha identity are flexible, fluid and permeable. Pakeha is an identity that is not determined by lineage but by living in a land and acting in the space which one inhabits. Therefore, no one set of behavioral pattern or cultural attitude can describe Pakeha. However, their culture is also significantly different from their lands of origin. Michael King, in his book Being Pakeha Now, Reflections and Recollections of a White Native 1999 writes, to be Pakeha on the cusp of the 21st century is not to be European. It is not to be an alien or a stranger in my own country. It is to be a non-Maori New Zealander who is aware of and proud of my antecedents, but who identifies intimately with this land as intensively and as strongly as anybody Maori. It is to be, as I have already argued, and the kind of indigenous New Zealander, unquote. There is an essential biculturalism in the identity of the Pakehas because they are mainly the people of the treaty. The Treaty of Waitangi put together two groups of people. The Pakeha, who are dominant in history, power and majority, and the Maori, who are dominant in legacy and longer history of being indigenous to the soil of Aotearoa. The desired impact of biculturalism was to forget the colonial past of the Pakeha and Maori entanglement and to establish an equality of the two where both will be equally sharing the responsibility of being inhabitants of the region. But the economic and social backwardness of the Maori as compared to the Pakeha challenges any such notion of equality. The South Pacific region is essentially multicultural. The notion of biculturalism proves that the two distinctly different groups of people cannot accommodate the other in ethnic terms. Now, we have discussed briefly about the Pakeha identity and the Pakeha Maori relation and the Pakeha social and cultural context. Now, let us talk about Pakeha literature and literary culture. So, the Pakeha as the powerful settlers of the Aotearoa had an account of the European discovery of the island, which was circulated among all sections of the people. Captain James Cook was regarded as the maritime hero, whose heroic stories of the late 18th century was celebrated. The benevolent missionaries and the pioneers from Britain were also regarded with similar reverence. Such settlers' myth continued with its popularity until the close of the 20th century, when a revisionist historical scholarship and historiographical fiction emerged, which reconsidered New Zealand's past. The most important studies include Claudia Orange's The Treaty of Waitangi 1987, James Bellich's The New Zealand Wars and the Interpretation of Racial Conflict 1986, historiographical novels such as Witi Ihimaera's Maori Author, The Matriarch 1986, and C.K. Stead's The Singing Wakapapa 1994. These works redetermine and reassesses the complex cross-cultural conflict between the Maori and Pakeha. The first encounters between Europeans and the Maori often led to misunderstandings and hostility from both sides. When Dutchman Abel Tasman came in 1642 and Cook came in the year 1769, both the encounters are marked with bloodshed and war. These misunderstandings between the Pakeha and the Maori inspired a series of revisionist poems produced by Pakeha poet Alan Carnot in the early 1940s. These poems were written when the country was celebrating the centenary of the singing of the Treaty of Waitangi and the birth of New Zealand. The poems have a more ambivalent attitude to the country's emerging nationhood, unlike the predominant idea of the nation belonging to the Pakeha. The poem House and Land describes New Zealand, a land of settlers with never a soul at home. The other poem, The Skeleton of the Great Moa in the Canterbury Museum, Christchurch, 1943, uses the metaphor of the bird to show the migratory and impermanent nature of the settlers. Poems like The Unhistory Story, 1941, and Landfall in Unknown Seas further challenges the base of the settlers' identity, challenging the mythical victory story of Tasman and Cook. The Unhistoric Story, with the line, "It was something different, something nobody counted on," challenges the popular version of the history and makes a foray into the random violence and hostility that marked the colonizers' encounter with the natives. One of the Pakeha texts, edited by Ken Arvidsson in 2001, is a non-fiction tract produced by Magistrate John Gorst, the Maori King, 1864. It documents the Imperial Army's invasion of the Waikato region in 1863 after the Waikato tribes had refused to sign the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. Waikato became the site of the Maori nationalism and Maori Kingitanga movement, although the King's movement was essentially non-violent. The imperial administration saw it to be an act of rebellion and ordered military invasion. After the end of the clash, Waikato was confiscated to the imperial government. Although the author is a Pakeha serving as a magistrate of the government, he has showed the courage of openly criticizing the manipulations of the government, but he cannot be called a pro-Maori, and he is also critical about their imitative nature. Another Pakeha text during the colonial period that has shown ambivalence towards the Maori is F.E. Manning's autobiography Old New Zealand in 1863. Manning was a Pakeha Maori who, being a resident European trader, married a Maori. Manning criticizes the land hunger of the British imperialists and the evangelistic intervention of the missionaries. He also could not escape the stereotypical representation of the Maori as cunning, cruel, and careless of life. By the end of the 19th century, when most of the Maori lands were annexed by the European settlers, they too started to develop a sense of nationhood. They helped in the development of New Zealand not only by establishing extensive road and rail networks, but also by granting female suffrage and national welfare reforms. From 1890s, New Zealand meant both a Maori and a Pakeha. The political nationalism developing in the late 19th century and the early 20th century gave rise to literary nationalism. From 1930 onwards, the literature produced by the Pakeha could shed the British literary model and showed a distinctive local sensibility. Poets like Alan Carnot, Dennis Glover, and Charles Brask rejected the earlier poets' way of writing as embarrassing colonial difference, outmodal verse forms, and Georgian diction, and the decorative use of native flora and fauna. According to this set of modern Pakeha poets, the poetry emerging from New Zealand should be realist, masculinist, and attentive to the minutiae and distinctiveness of the local environment rather than expressing nostalgia for the British motherland. Unquote. In Carnot's Book of New Zealand Verse 1923-45, which was published in 1945, he charges the established female poets like Ellen Dahan and Robin Hyde of overt sentimentalism and an escapism reflected in their poems. He is high praise for poets like R.A.K. Mason and Walter D. Archie Creswell for the manliness, toughness, and technical sureness that they introduce in their poems. A.R.D. Fairbairn, in his 1938 poem dominion reflects on the New Zealand culture and engages with the effects of the First World War and the depression upon New Zealand's emergent sense of national identity. Fairbairn thought the poems written in American should be an useful model for the new poems being written in New Zealand. But the poems that Fairbairn and Carnot was writing resembled the Auden tradition of the 1930 Britain. In the genre of prose short stories of Frank Sargason tried to capture realism and sympathy for the ordinary bloc. This literary tradition continued in New Zealand until 1970s till Maori Renaissance made a mark on New Zealand literature. Although New Zealand granted female suffrage to women as early as 1893, the assessment of feminist impact on literature was made as late as 1970s. Robin Hyde is one of the most prominent female authors who battled mental illness. Her poetry was marked with a chaotic, escapist hysteria. Her semi-autobiographical novel, The Godwit's Fly, 1938, gives a view of the New Zealand society, revealing the way in which class divisions between Irish, English and other immigrant groups in Wellington were altered by the Depression and by international socialism. She also takes up the issue of Pakeha nationalism and how a local aesthetic pervaded the culture among the Pakeha in the 1930s. She points out the changing of the Pakeha attitude towards the Maori, which marks a shift from what works like Ranulph and Ammonia by Alfred Domet and the Greenstone Tour 1914 by William Satwich. The other most important female writer is Catherine Mansfield, who wrote about her childhood spent in Wellington in her The Garden Party and Other Stories. The stories like The Garden Party and The Doll's House explore the class divisions that problematized, idealized myths of social inclusion, which during the beyond this period were circulated in order to promote New Zealand as a utopian better Britain. Her unfinished novel Mata is named after her Maori girlfriend with whom she appears to have had a sexual relationship. Her 1912 story, How Pearl Burton Was Kidnapped, engages directly with the Maori culture, but her stance on the Maori is quite ambivalent. She mostly describes them as fat and laughing, and seem to have an abundance of food and children. Jane Mander's 1920 novel, The Story of a New Zealander River, describes the experience of an English woman who married a Pakeha man and settled in New Zealand. She criticizes the false secularized Puritan code of respectability imported from Victorian England that used to get imposed upon New Zealand. John Mulgan's novel Man Alone 1939 describes a Pakeha man's solitary journey in the alien landscape and is a typical settler's writing. The settlers' narratives often carried a thread of how a white man or woman had to battle against the savage spirit of the country, as in Janet Fehm's 1966 novel A State of Siege, where a retired female teacher is found dead while on a solitary sojourn in an island where she was terrorized by persistent knocking on the door by an unknown intruder. She died as someone threw a stone at her through her window. Fehm's another novel, The Carpathians, engages with the Pakeha Maori relationship and explore Pakeha cultural schizophrenia and various forms of social marginalization. The female writers are a significant presence in the literary arena of New Zealand and balance the masculinist bias of the male authors and poets. Now, let us summarize the model. In this module, we have learned about the geographical region of South Pacific and specifically the region of Ottawa. We have learned about the Pakeha community of New Zealand, its heterogeneity, and how its identity develops as a result of the encounter with the Maori or the indigenous people of the region. A section on the Pakeha identity politics talked about how the Pakeha identity is neither that of colonizer nor of the pre-colonial but a predominantly unique and hybrid post-colonial subjectivity which might be constituted of the two as well. The following section concentrates on the literatures of the Pakeha, which had evolved and developed over the years from an objective take of the white-skinned explorer colonizers on the savage island of the South Pacific to a more subjective belongings of a Pakeha to his homeland of New Zealand, which has a completely local essence shading of the characteristics of British literature. For further reading, you please consult the further reading list which is provided here, and for self-assessment you consult the self-assessment file. Thank you.